Welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. In this lecture, we're going to try to briefly answer the question, so what is this philosophy stuff about anyway? Our readings for Module 1 gave us 3 different strategies for potentially answering this question. Together, these readings provide us with 3 lenses through which the nature of philosophy might be viewed: a conceptual lens, an axiological lens, and an existential lens. The first way that philosophy might be viewed is through what's called conceptual analysis. When Elizabeth and Monroe Beardsley describe philosophy as the discipline that investigates questions that are both more general and more fundamental than the questions asked by other disciplines, they are giving us an analysis of the conceptual foundations of philosophical inquiry. Another approach might be to make the axiological case for the importance of philosophy. Axiology is the philosophical study of value, of the reasons why we consider some pursuits to be important, ethical, or worthwhile. In The Value of Philosophy, Bertrand Russell makes an impassioned and at times poetic case for the urgency of philosophical inquiry. According to Russell, we should care, and care deeply, about the kinds of questions that philosophy poses, questions which expand the boundaries of human thought. The Beardsleys tell us what philosophy is. Russell tells us why philosophy matters. Finally, Socrates provides us with a living definition of the existential practice of philosophy as a form of practical engagement with the world, as he pleads for his life before a hostile jury in ancient Athens. In a 2020 survey of 1,785 professional philosophers, almost 75% ranked conceptual analysis as the most important method for doing philosophy. Conceptual analysis involves taking our concepts apart, identifying the individual components that form the skeletons of our ideas, disassembling our underlying assumptions about the world piece by piece until we have our deepest intuitions pinned like butterflies beneath the microscope of critical scrutiny. The goal is clarity and precision, to make our concepts as clear and as precisely defined as possible, to remove every possibility of error. No concept, not life, not reality, not consciousness, not truth itself, escapes the microscope of philosophical analysis. Not even philosophy itself can escape philosophical scrutiny. When the Beardsleys ask, "What is philosophy?" they are applying the methods of conceptual analysis to the subject of philosophy itself. They are engaging in what's called metaphilosophy, or the philosophy of philosophy. Metaphilosophy is philosophy turning its restless gaze upon itself, interrogating its own nature, and thinking critically about its own methods of critical thinking. Our first module in this course is an exercise in metaphilosophy. Perhaps the most straightforward answer to the question, what is philosophy, might be that philosophy is whatever is typically taught in philosophy courses like this one. In most American universities, what is taught is a version of the history of philosophy that is known as the Western philosophical tradition. In this version of the story, philosophy, from the Greek philosophia, meaning the love of wisdom, begins around 2,400 years ago in the ancient city of Athens, Greece. For 2,000 years, the human understanding of truth, knowledge, ethics, mind, and reality were shaped by the teachings of 3 men: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Then, around 400 years ago, this ancient worldview was radically overturned and transformed by the rise of the scientific revolution. Where Plato saw a world of rational perfection, and Aristotle saw a world of cosmic purpose, the modern philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment saw the world as a great machine, a cunningly designed clockwork that could be disassembled, its parts isolated and analyzed, and its ultimate blueprint read off of the discoveries of science. Then in the 20th century, in the aftermath of Einstein, quantum mechanics, and 2 world wars, the nature of philosophy shifted once again. 2 schools of contemporary philosophy began to form. In England and America, philosophers of the analytic tradition began developing increasingly powerful tools of logical analysis, which they applied to dissecting the internal structure of language, to sharpening our descriptions of the world until they carved nature precisely at its joints, revealing through conceptual analysis the hidden architecture of reality that science was uncovering through laboratory experiments. But where the analytic philosophers of the Anglo-American universities saw reason and language as tools for understanding the world, philosophers of the European continental tradition viewed reason and language far more critically. War had revealed the power that appeals to cold reason and objective language could wield, not to reveal reality, but to distort and manipulate it. The role of the philosopher was not to passively describe reality, but to instead engage in an active and ongoing critique of the roles of power and authority in shaping and reshaping cultural and political reality. At this point, an astute observer might point out that there is a whole lot of world outside of America, England, and Europe that seems to be getting left out of this story. And as we enter the 21st century, philosophers have increasingly begun to belatedly acknowledge that the great chain of Western philosophy that runs from ancient Greece through Enlightenment Europe before splitting into the analytic and continental traditions might not in fact be the entire story. One clue was the fact that Chinese philosophy actually preceded the ancient Greeks by about a century, and Indian philosophy preceded both by about a millennium. The world is and has always been teeming with philosophy. Wherever a curious mind encounters a mysterious reality, in that encounter, philosophy is born. Today, we philosophers are post-analytic, post-continental, and post-colonial. The world of philosophical discourse is belatedly expanding to encompass traditions, histories, and concepts beyond the narrow Western canon. Currently, some of the most exciting contemporary philosophical work is coming out of non-Western traditions. The African Ubuntu tradition of relational ethics, the Cameroonian theorist Achille Mbembe's concept of necropolitics, the Buen Vivir notion of human flourishing in Latin America, Confucian role ethics, and indigenous place-based knowledge represent just a brief sample of contemporary topics. So, as we move through the modules in this course, please keep in mind that this is simply one way among many of telling the story of philosophy. The readings in our textbook, Exploring Philosophy, 8th edition, by Stephen M. Kahn, are primarily representative of the Western philosophical tradition as it is still taught in most American universities. And within that tradition, Kahn's anthology is mostly a work that sits squarely within the scope of analytic philosophy. And so we begin Module 1 with this metaphilosophical reflection on the nature of philosophy itself. From here, we move to examining the actual methods of philosophical reasoning employed by contemporary analytic philosophers in Module 2. There, we'll look at how the tools of formal logic can be employed to unearth the hidden premises in arguments, and how scientific reasoning moves from speculative hypotheses to robust and established theories. If Module 1 is about the philosophical pursuit of knowledge, and Module 2 is about the methods for acquiring knowledge, then Module 3 is about the nature of knowledge itself, what philosophers call epistemology. What does it mean when we say that we know something rather than merely suspect it or believe it? With the foundations of philosophy, reasoning, and knowledge established, or at least brought into a more productive uncertainty, we'll move from epistemology to metaphysics, the application of philosophical methods to the study of the nature of reality. Module 4 will investigate the nature of mind and consciousness. What does it mean to have a mind? Is it something different from having a brain and a body? Is a mind something that only humans and other biological animals can have? Or does anything that performs the same sorts of functions as a brain necessarily produce the same sort of mind? Module 5 moves from the nature of minds to the nature of free will. If, as science seems to tell us, the universe is a clockwork system where the same effects always follow necessarily from the same causes, then how do we account for our felt sense of agency, of choosing freely between genuinely uncertain alternatives? For our last 2 modules, we'll move from the abstract and cosmic questions of mind and agency to the concrete and existential questions of ethics and justice. What do we mean when we say that one act is moral and another act is immoral? What grounds this evaluation between moral and immoral, ethical and unethical, good and evil? Is morality universal, or does it vary from culture to culture, or even from person to person? Module 6 will tackle these questions in the philosophy of ethics. Finally, we'll pull back the camera to take in the full scope of lived socio-political reality in Module 7. What makes a society just rather than unjust? What duties do individuals have to one another within a community? What role does community play in constituting the rights of individuals? Are equality and justice even possible in a world built upon historical foundations of injustice? There are no single definitive answers to these questions. That's in part what makes them philosophical questions. But they are nevertheless urgent questions. We cannot live together in a world without facing these questions. In the words of the psychologist and philosopher William James, such questions are forced, they are alive, and they are momentous. They are forced because we can't help but face them, to struggle with them, to decide for ourselves where we stand in regard to them. They are alive because they represent real possibilities about the world and about our place within it. And they are momentous because they push beyond the settled certainties of other disciplines and other types of knowledge. They push against the very limits of human reasoning itself. And if Bertrand Russell is right, then struggling with such questions is valuable in itself. Regardless of the answers, or the possibilities of definite answers, we become better and more critical thinkers through the very act of considering them. And that is all for this brief lecture on metaphilosophy. Next up, we'll look at how the Beardsleys, Bertrand Russell, and Socrates respectively define, evaluate, and embody the nature of philosophy. And I'll see you there.